November 1944. A supply route near Metz, France. Heavy canvas covers the cargo beds of 2.5-ton trucks idling in the dense autumn fog. Mud cakes the fenders. Exhaust pipes cough gray smoke into the cold air. Drivers wait for the order to move. But this morning, the trucks do not roll under the protective blanket of darkness. Instead, a new command forces them onto the open roads under a clear sky. A single aircraft engine roars in the distance. The sound grows louder, sharper, piercing the low clouds. It is a German fighter. Machine gun fire rips through the lead vehicle, tearing metal and flesh apart. Screams echo across the French countryside. This is the tragic result of a safety policy drafted thousands of miles away from the front lines. But General George S. Patton has a devastating response for the paperwork that cost American lives. This is the story of what happened when a safety rule forced Third Army supply convoys into daylight, allowing German fighters to strafe them. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when politics outranks combat. Sergeant Miguel Reyes was 26 years old. He came from the dusty border town of Laredo, Texas. He wore the olive-drab uniform of the 3rd Army Transportation Corps. Before the war, Reyes hauled commercial freight across the desert highways of the American Southwest. He knew engines. He knew how to read a map in the dark. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor because he believed a man should protect his home. He had driven supply trucks through the mud of Normandy and across the blood-soaked fields of northern France. He had seen friends die in head-on collisions on unlit roads. He had pulled charred bodies from burning cabs. The burden of keeping his drivers alive weighed heavily on his shoulders. The black rings under his eyes showed the cost of his sleepless nights. He was a man who measured success by the number of men he brought back to camp. Now, he stood by the side of a cratered road, watching his men die in broad daylight because of a piece of paper. Colonel Preston Hayes was 42 years old. He worked in the Transportation Safety Division at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. He came from an old, wealthy family in Washington, D.C. His uniform was tailored, clean, and perfectly pressed. His boots shone like glass. Hayes had never seen a combat trench. He had never heard the screech of an incoming artillery shell. He spent his days in a heated brick office in England, surrounded by filing cabinets and grease pencils. He viewed the war through charts and columns of figures. He believed that numbers never lied, and that variance from the regulation was the ultimate administrative sin. He often told his staff that a collision in the rear was identical to a loss at the front. His privilege kept him safe from the wet, freezing reality of the mud. His obsession with spreadsheets made him completely blind to the existence of the German Air Force. By November 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had slowed to a grueling crawl. The rapid dash that followed the breakout from Normandy was over. The German army had retreated to its own borders, dug in behind deep concrete fortifications, and begun fighting with desperate ferocity. Supply lines for the American forces were stretched to the absolute breaking point. Every single gallon of gasoline, every crate of artillery shells, and every ration box had to travel hundreds of miles from the portsat on the coast to the cutting edge of the front line. The trucks of the 3rd Army Transportation Battalions were the lifeblood of the entire offensive. If the trucks stopped rolling, the tanks would run dry and the infantry would be left defenseless. Because of the critical nature of these supply lines, combat commanders had established rigid tactical procedures. Convoys drove almost exclusively under the cover of night. Drivers navigated shattered French roads without headlights, using only the tiny, dim slits of blackout markers to follow the vehicle ahead. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work that tested the endurance of every man behind the wheel. Yet, the strategy worked. The darkness shielded the massive columns of trucks from the prying eyes of the enemy. German artillery observers could not target what they could not see, and the Luftwaffe was largely blind after sunset. The system was highly effective, keeping supply losses near zero for weeks. But as the front lines pushed closer to the German border, administrative oversight from the rear echelons began to tighten. Bureaucrats in comfortable offices across the English Channel started reviewing the operational data. They saw the inevitable fender-benders, the ditchings, and the minor collisions caused by exhausted men driving heavy machinery through pitch-black nights. They decided to fix the numbers, oblivious to the fact that the shadow of the enemy changed every rule of safety. Sergeant Reyes walked into the operations tent, holding a blood-stained clipboard. Colonel Hayes sat at a folding table, polishing his fingernails with a small emery board. "Colonel, we have a crisis on the Metz route," Reyes said. Hayes did not look up from his table. "There is no crisis, Sergeant. Only a failure to adhere to the schedule, sir. The first daylight convoy just got torn to pieces by a Messerschmitt," Reyes said. Hayes blew a speck of dust off his thumb. "Accidents happen in any transportation network." "That was not an accident, Colonel. That was enemy action, because we are driving in the sunshine," Reyes said. "The safety directive is clear," Hayes said. "Nighttime driving accidents exceed acceptable safety margins. Our nighttime losses were zero," Reyes said. "Your nighttime fender-benders were unacceptable," Hayes said. "My men are dead." "Colonel," Reyes said, "2 drivers are in body bags right now because you wanted to fix a statistic. They died because they failed to maintain defensive intervals during a standard daytime movement," Hayes said. "There is nothing standard about a fighter plane strafing a line of unarmored trucks," Reyes said. "The data from the United Kingdom proves that daytime transport maximizes vehicle longevity and driver alertness," Hayes said. "This is not England, sir," Reyes said. "There are no Germans in England. The regulation applies to all theaters of operation without exception." Hayes said, "The road is wide open, Colonel, and the enemy can see us from 5 miles away," Reyes said. "Then you will adjust your driving habits to comply with the safety parameters," Hayes said. "I will not send another column out there to be slaughtered, just to keep your paperwork clean," Reyes said. "You will obey the directive, Sergeant, or I will have you removed for insubordination," Hayes said. "The safety office does not dictate tactical movement in a combat zone," Reyes said. "The safety office outranks your battlefield opinions, Sergeant," Hayes said. "Frontline personnel do not possess the statistical overview required to evaluate total force risk." "You are killing my drivers to save some fenders," Reyes said. "Your drivers are a resource, and that resource is managed by the Supreme Headquarter Safety Division," Hayes said. "If you refuse to lead the next daylight run, I will find an officer who will." Reyes stared at the polished boots of the colonel. He knew his words meant nothing to a man who lived inside a filing cabinet. He turned around and walked out of the tent into the freezing rain. He went straight to the field telephone and asked the operator to connect him to 3rd Army headquarters. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His jeep pulled up to the gate of the transportation area. With a screech of tires on mud, 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory handles of his revolvers caught the dim light. Every man in the camp snapped to attention. The air grew perfectly still. He walked into the operations tent, unannounced, his boots striking the floor with rhythmic, metallic clicks. He did not look at the maps. He looked only at the colonel, Colonel Hayes. "Why did those drivers die this morning?" Patton asked. "They were following the SAF daytime transit protocol, General," Hayes said. "Did the enemy follow your protocol?" Patton asked. "The regulation is designed to minimize total theater infrastructure damage," Hayes said. "Did the regulation save those 3 trucks?" Patton asked. "The statistical model accounts for a baseline of operational attrition," Hayes said. Patton studied him for a cold, silent moment. "You sit in this tent with polished shoes and a warm stove, measuring the war in percentages. You read a spreadsheet from England and believe you understand the roads of France. You see a dented fender in a London alleyway and equate it to a strafing run by a German fighter. Your data is accurate for a country with no enemy. In England, The night is dangerous because your drivers are green and the roads are narrow. In France, the daytime is deadly because the enemy has eyes, artillery, and airplanes. You have applied peacetime logic to a killing zone, and the price of your arithmetic is paid in American blood. Sergeant Reyes knows the road. His men know the dark. They navigate by the stars and the shadow of the trees, because the dark is their armor. You took away their armor because you were worried about a baseline of operational attrition. You made them visible to the Luftwaffe to satisfy a clerk in Washington. You have a choice. You will lead the next supply convoy yourself in broad daylight, driving the lead truck without an armored escort, or you will stand face to face with the families of the men your paperwork killed. Decide now. Hayes opened his mouth to cite the regulation, but the words caught in his throat as he looked into the general's eyes. He closed his folder and stood up. Colonel Hayes climbed into the cab of the lead GMC truck. His hands shook as he gripped the cold steering wheel. The polished leather of his boots smeared wet mud across the rubber floor mats. Behind him, a line of 20 unarmored cargo vehicles idled in the blinding midday sun. Sergeant Reyes watched from the roadside, his jaw tight, his arms crossed over his chest. The order was given, and the heavy gears ground together. The convoy rolled out of the staging area, exposed, bright, and completely visible against the pale French sky. Within 10 minutes, the horizon shattered. The high-pitched whine of a BMW radial engine tore through the clouds. A single German fighter dived toward the column. Hayes slammed his foot on the brake as cannon shells stitched a line of fire across the dirt. The impact threw him against the dashboard. Shrapnel ripped through the canvas canopy behind his head. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled the cab. Soldiers scrambled into the ditches for cover. Hayes stared through the cracked windshield at the empty road ahead, his ears ringing. His pristine uniform soaked in sweat and grease. He had seen the baseline of operational attrition up close. Sergeant Miguel Reyes survived the strafing run and the bitter winter of 1944. After the German surrender, he returned home to Laredo, Texas, where the hot desert sun felt completely different from the freezing mud of northern France. He went back to commercial freight driving, guiding massive trucks across the open highways of the American West. He never drove at night if he could avoid it, preferring the clear visibility of the daylight hours he had once fought to avoid. He died in 1982, leaving behind a family that remembered him as a man who cared more for his soldiers than for any military medal. Colonel Preston Hayes was quietly reassigned to an administrative post in Washington, D.C. before the onset of the Battle of the Bulge. The report of his daylight run was buried deep within the bureaucratic files of the Transportation Corps. He never received another field command, spending the remainder of his career inside the windowless offices of the Pentagon. He retired from the Army in 1954 and spent his remaining years writing long, detailed articles for civilian logistics journals, defending the importance of statistical uniformity in global transport. He passed away in 1971, bitter that his meticulously gathered safety data had been overridden by a single field general. General Patton never spoke about the incident publicly, and no official record of the confrontation was ever entered into the Third Army Chronicle. However, a small leather-bound notebook found among his personal papers contained a brief, handwritten entry dated late November. The note stated that the only true measurement of safety in a theater of war is the destruction of the enemy. It concluded with a single line in his own script, noting that a dented fender can be hammered out in a repair shop, but a dead driver can never be replaced by an administrative regulation. Some historians have argued that Colonel Hayes was simply trying to enforce a necessary institutional standard across a massive global logistics network. They point out that night driving accidents caused severe structural damage to limited vehicle pools and disrupted delivery timelines across the entire European theater. From this perspective, Standardization was the only way to maintain long-term operational efficiency. Other historians have argued the opposite, asserting that rear-echelon bureaucrats consistently failed to grasp the fluid danger of the active front line. They maintained that local tactical safety must always override rigid administrative procedures dictated from afar. What is certain is that Patton's decisive intervention firmly re-established combat reality over peacetime metrics, ensuring that the tactical invisibility of the dark remained the primary shield for the drivers of the Third Army. If you had been in General Patton's position, would you have overridden the safety directive to protect your drivers, or would you have followed the orders from Supreme Headquarters? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more hidden stories about what happens when politics outranks combat, make sure to subscribe to the channel.